Hello and welcome back to another tutorial. So here we are again in the Django DRF and React series, building a simple blog with the Django Rest Framework. So far we have covered building a simple REST API. So we had an introduction to the REST API services with Django, and then we built a small React front end. And then in the second series we looked at permissions, or the second tutorial we looked at permissions in the DRF package, or using permissions in the REST framework. And in this tutorial, we're looking at JWT. So the focus of this tutorial then is JSON Web Tokens. So we'll explain what they are in a minute, but by the end of this tutorial, you will have a Django application which will be serving JWT tokens to a front end. And then you'll have a front end. In this case, we're using React to save those tokens and to use them to request data from our RESTful API service. So we're going to give you a quick overview of JWT, just to give you an overview and try and get it in your mind, a picture in your mind, so you can understand the basics of the flow almost of utilizing these tokens and why we might need them. And then we go on to then configure Django, our RESTful API. Now we are using the code from previous tutorials, so there's a link in the description if you want to utilize the existing code. If you want to start this series from the start, then by all means go to the first tutorial and start there. And then once we've done Django, we'll then move over to the front end React. And again, we have built a small app already from the first tutorial. So we'll take that tutorial application code and we'll just build upon that and then add in the JWT component so that we can start authenticating with the server. Okay, so let's first answer why we might need JSON Web Tokens. So this scenario here, we have an application here that could just be a website, sends a HTTP request to the server, and then we retrieve some data and so on. And then we send some more requests and then get some more data and so on. Every request response pair here is completely independent of the previous one. No one here, whether it be the server or the application here in the front end, is storing in memory any information about the past interactions. So if we would apply this scenario now to what we have, React will send, or we would log in via React, say. So we'd type in our username and password, we send it to the server. We authenticate, the server sends a message back saying, great, you've now authenticated. The problem here is stateless, so no one is recording that information. So now what we do is we send a request for data, and of course the server doesn't remember that you've just logged in. So it says, sorry, you need to log in to access any data. And this is what the problem is. So this is where JWT, JSON Web Tokens, come into play. In React, we're going to log in using a normal login form. We're going to send that across to our server and log in, authenticate with the server. The server is going to generate some tokens, some web tokens, and it's going to send it back to us in React. And then in React or somewhere on that device, we're going to store those tokens. And every time we then request data, we're going to send that token across with our request. The server will be recording the fact that that token exists and has been authenticated because we've logged in. And therefore, we can then send data back to React. So it just allows us to maintain a state, an open state, a logged in state. So let's just explore this idea a little bit further. So we have JSON Web Tokens. What we're going to be working with are two different tokens here. So the access token and the refresh token. So the access token typically has a short expiry, maybe 10, 20 minutes, for example, and this is configurable. And the refresh token might have a longer expiry. So let's explore why that is. So once we've configured JWT on the server, typically this is what's going to happen by default. So React is going to request a service or some data. The RESTful API might send a message back saying, okay, we've got JWT authentication set up on the server, and you're going to need to authenticate yourself before you can access the data. And then what we can do is, well, in this case, React hasn't been set up. So we say, sorry, we don't have a token, and therefore we don't have any access. Okay, so let's have a look at the whole process, and that's going to give us a better idea of what it is that we need to develop here. So in React, we need a login page because we want to post the login details across to the server. That's the first step. And then once that's happened and we are authenticated, Django is going to send back two tokens, our access and refresh tokens. We then can send a HTTP request and then potentially without the tokens, and then the server would say, no, we're going to need your JWT authentication tokens. And then what happens then? We send another request with our access token. So we send the request and our new access token that we're saved in React. And at that point, the server can now send us back data. And then anytime we want data, we'll send a request and the access token, and then we get data back from the server. Now, access tokens, like I've already mentioned, they expire. So they have a timed amount, or they have a certain amount of time they're valid for, and after that time, they then expire. So what happens now? Well, what we could do now is we could go back to the first step and just log in. But generally, access tokens have a short expiry, maybe sometimes just 5 minutes. So the problem with that is that we're going to be logging in every 5 minutes. So this is the reason, or one of the reasons, we have a refresh token. So a refresh token has a longer expiry date or time, maybe 5-10 days, for example. And that's like, for example, if you're familiar with sessions, we have a way of getting another access token for that period. So for those 10 days, we don't, or 5 days, or however long your refresh token is set for, we don't need to log in again. So we just need to send across to the server the refresh token, and then the server will issue us another access token. So here, for example, we send a request with our access token, and then we find out, or the server tells us that the token has expired. And all that happens is that we need to programmatically capture that and then send across our refresh token. Remember, our refresh token was delivered to us initially when we logged in. So we're saving that within our states here somewhere. So we send across a refresh token, our server sends back a new access token, and then we can continue as per normal. So what I've described to you there really is the nuts and bolts here of what's happening in the background. And once you do understand it, it is fairly straightforward, really, what's happening. And again, this just details really, in a lot of respects, what it is that we need to actually develop within our applications. This is a system that we need to develop. So in addition to that, the refresh token. So imagine we then send a refresh token. I've already mentioned this, but imagine we send the refresh token because our access token has expired and we get unauthorized. That means that the refresh token has expired, in which case we then need to log in and then get some new tokens. So that's the other scenario that we need to develop. Of course, that's just the login that we develop at the start of the process. Okay, so in short then, we need to enable JWT in Django, which is just going to be a package we install. We're going to need to handle a login service in Django. Now this is completely separate from JWT. The login service is just a normal Django login facility, so we can develop it as such. So obviously we're utilizing a RESTful API, so we'll be expecting to see those requests from a client somewhere being sent across in JSON, for example. So we're going to need to serialize that data, similar to what we've done in the first tutorial, where we serialized the data, etc. And then once we've done that, Django needs to issue a JSON web token. So those two tokens I mentioned, the access token and the refresh token. So that's pretty much all that Django needs to do there. And then on the React side, we're going to build a register system. So we're going to be able to register a new user in React. So we'll build that, and then we're going to build the login facility and then capturing the new JWT tokens. Now in this tutorial, we're going to be just utilizing the local storage for now. And then in later tutorials, we'll have a look at different storage areas where we can store the JWT tokens, because there are some security implications here. So once we've logged in, captured the JWT tokens, we then just need to handle the refresh token. So this is something that we programmatically need to do. So we need to capture when the server has identified, or when the server maybe returns a authentication required request, or it tells us that we need to authenticate. And at that point, programmatically, we're just going to send across the refresh token, back to the server and try and get a new token. But obviously, we're only going to send the refresh token if we actually have it available. Because one could assume that if we do have a refresh token and we aren't building a proper connection and we know that the connection is working, then it probably just means that we need to refresh our token. If you want to learn a little bit more about JWT, there's a website, jwt.io, with some resources that are handy. But we're just going to have a look at this because there's something interesting at the bottom here, and that's the debugger. So here what we can do is we can take some of our tokens and we can have a look to see what they're actually doing. So we can see that this on the left-hand side is a token that you'll get familiar with. This is a token that will be sent from the server. This was a token that this is what a token will look like, that is sent from your server to your application. So that's what it looks like. And we can see here when it's decoded, in actual fact, you can see that it actually means something here. So in here somewhere, decoded, we can see the expiry date. It has a unique identifier, which is obviously very important for security here. That's a unique identifier that's going to identify that session or that person's logged in. And then we have the user ID as well. So something that we can send across in our encoded token is the fact that we're using user ID number 1 or 2 or 3, and this is going to uniquely identify the user that's logged in. And of course, this type of information is really handy when we start to think about other logic that we're going to need to perform in our system to uniquely identify the user and what they do within the system. So other things to think about here is just some security type of measures. And these are just parameters that we can configure, and we'll have a look at configuring those shortly. So let's go ahead and have a look at see what the final outcome will be. So this is our React application here. So we're going to have a simple home page where we're waiting to load the data. So that was from the previous tutorial. Now, how this is set up in this tutorial is that we can't access the data until we're logged in. So we're not currently logged in here. So we've got the screen that says we are waiting for the data to load because we need to be authenticated. So let's go ahead and log in. So I've got a number of different login users here. So once we've logged in, what's going to happen is we're going to retrieve a token from the server, remember. So let's just sign in. That takes us back to the home page, and you can now see we've got all the posts, and there's only one post in the system at the moment. So let's just go behind the scenes here and have a look in the console here. So if we go into the console and go over to application, you can see in the local storage, we're storing the refresh and access token. These are the tokens that we've retrieved from the server because we've logged in. So that's what I was explaining before in the process I was showing you here. So I'm just going through this process almost. Okay, so now we've got the tokens here. What we can do, as you see, we can access the data on the screen. So when we log out, now to log out, essentially what we need to do is we need to remove the tokens here. And in the back end, we need to do another activity as well. And we'll do that at the end of this tutorial, and we'll talk about that a little bit further. So if you're wondering how to log out, essentially what we're doing here is we're just removing all of these tokens from the front end. So if I log out and don't have the tokens anymore, it means that when I try and go back to the home page and make the request for the data, then the data cannot be captured because we're not sending across now our token with the request. So if I go into the console here, it says 401 unauthorized because we're not sending across the token. So for the front end, in terms of signed in and signed out, logged in and logged out, is a really simple process. You just need to remove the tokens from the front end, and then the request won't be able to make any requests with the authenticated tokens. So in addition to that, this is React you're looking at here. We're also just create a register page where we can add new users. So we'll do that too. So that's what we're going to be doing on the React application. Okay, so this is a final view of the front end application. Really all we're doing here is we have set up JWT in Django. So we'll do that first shortly. But you can see here, the end game here is that we've got these tokens here. So if I go into the outstanding tokens, these are all the tokens that have been issued by this server. And it looks as though, if we go up here, if this expires at this time here. So you can see that these tokens will expire and then we won't be able to use them. Now, when we log out a user, the thing is, these tokens will still exist. So people will still be able to use the refresh token to actually access and get more access tokens until this expires. So what we have available here and what we're set up is a blacklisted tokens. So when the user logs out, what we'll do is we'll move the access token, we'll move the refresh token over to the blacklisted tokens, which means that when someone logs out, no one else will be able to use that refresh token and get any more tokens for that particular login session that happened. So that's something, that's a process that we'll go through in this tutorial. So hopefully now you have a better idea of what JWT tokens are, how they're being utilized, why they're being utilized in the system, and also I've given you an idea of what we're actually developing in this tutorial. So now let's just go ahead and start our Django application. Like I said, there's a link in the description if you want to follow this tutorial. And we're going to start the application and start from where we left off in tutorial 2. So if you have downloaded the code, what you're going to need to do is just create a new virtual environment. So I've just run the venv here and created a virtual environment. And then you're next up, I didn't leave a requirements file in actual fact. I do apologize. I'll try and update that. But if I haven't done that, what you'll need to do is just create your virtual environment, go into the virtual environment, start it up, and then just pip install. We're going to need to pip install Django. And then in addition to that, we'll just need to pip install the Django framework, the Django Rest Framework. If you have a look in the commands text here, in actual fact, all the commands are here that you need, more or less. So we just need to pip install the Django Rest Framework. Like I said, apologies, I didn't leave a requirements text here. So that should be it. And then we should be able to just run that. And there seems to be an error. So here I'm getting a win error 123. The file name, directory name, or volume name syntax is incorrect. And the reason why that is I've still not worked out what that problem is, which is really bizarre. But if you are getting that problem, then do not fear, because you'd also need to pip install the Django cores header. That was just another package that needs to be installed. So let's just see now, we've installed that package and it's all working. So the server should be up now, so let's have a look. So there isn't really going to be too much to see here. So if you remember everything's on the API, if you've seen the other tutorials. Now, notice straight away that when we go to API, authentication credentials were not provided. So by default, you have to be logged in to the server to access this information. So we're going to make a few changes here in actual fact. And first thing we're going to do is just go over to the core, go into the settings. We're just going to change the default authentication or permission settings here. So if you remember, the front end or the package or the application-wide permission was that we couldn't access any page, or at least we can access, the page or read only, but we have to be authenticated to do anything useful. So we're just going to remove this for this particular instance, and we're just going to use something a little bit more simple in this. So just make sure that you're using allow any at this point. So permissions allow any. Now there's good reasons why you might want to change that to allow any. And for example, we are trying to allow users to access views whereby they are posting registration details and they are logging in. So if we had the previous setting, that could potentially cause problems when someone's trying to log in or trying to register. So the default permission project-wise is going to be allow any, and then we'll drill down in the permissions in the individual views. Setting up JSON Web Tokens is incredibly easy with this package here called Simple JWT. So we're going to go ahead and install this first. So go ahead and pip install Django Rest Framework. So I've already done that. So that's the first step that you need to take. And then we can go ahead and actually activate JWT Authentication. And you can see here what we're going to need to do is to create a new area called Default Authentication Classes. So let's go back into our settings again. And you can see here we've got the REST framework and the default permission classes. That's what we've just defined there. So now we're just going to go ahead and define the default authentication classes. And that's going to be the new JWT authentication. I suppose I could have just said we're now going to configure the default authentication classes for our REST framework. And there we go. So this is going to be the default authentication package that we're going to use to authenticate users to allow access to our data. Okay, so next up, we're going to configure some URLs. So notice here, it gives us two URLs, one for getting a token and then one for refreshing a token. So there's two views that are built into this package here, which is going to manage and handle that for us. We just need to add the URLs. So let's go ahead and think about where we want to put those. I think we'll start off by going into the core. So let's just put these into the core. So we've got two new paths here, one that goes to the API token and one that goes to the API token refresh. So with that in place, we just need to bring in all the dependencies here from the REST framework. So let's do that. So that just ties it up with the views that are already pre-configured and created for us in the framework, in the package that we installed. So let's just not forget a comma there. That's why we're getting a problem there. So on mine, I'm getting this yellow underline here, indicating that potentially that the package isn't installed, but it is. So don't worry about that if you're having the same problem. So at this point, that really is all that we need to do to start generating JWT tokens. So what we can do now is try this out. So let's just remember that our API token is on this address here. So the server's turned on, I believe. So let's just double check that. I think I've got it in the other command prompt here. Nope, okay. So let's just run the server. So let's now go into Postman and have a look to see how we're going to configure this. So I introduced Postman in I think it was the second tutorial or the first tutorial. So we're just going to go into here, and this tool is going to allow us to trial and access our API. We're going to use this to try out accessing our API. And you can see I've got a lot of tabs open here, for example, for different methods and different things I want to perform and test. So what I want to do here is try and access a JSON token. So let's open up a new tab. And we know that if we go to http:// and then our address, and then we go to API token, here, this is the endpoint that's going to allow us to generate a token. So I press send. It says method get not allowed. Okay, so we're not getting the token. We're going to post. So press send again, and it says email and password is required. So what is email and password? Well, this is authentication. So in order for us to get a token, remember, we need to be a user of the system. That's important, right? So let's go ahead now and actually add some data here so we can then actually collect a token and show a token. So to try and move our system forward a little bit quicker here, we're not actually going to be utilizing the default user table in this project. So I just want to spend a couple of minutes, and you can skip this if you like. I'm going to spend a couple of minutes now just setting up a new table for users. So we're going to overwrite the Django table settings, or we're going to overwrite the default user tables, and we're going to create a new custom user table. So I want to manage my users in a new application. So let's just start off by creating a new app. We're going to call that users. So we're creating a new app here called users, and we're going to the models, and now we're going to make a custom model for our new user. Now, if you've seen the tutorial in this channel for making custom users, I'm just going to utilize and follow the same process there. So if you've done that and got the code, you can just copy and paste this in. So apologies for that reason. I won't go through this in massive amount of detail. I'll give you a quick overview. Again, there is a tutorial that shows you this exact process and a little bit more detail on this, but here you can see in my models what I'm doing is I'm using the abstract base user, and that's going to allow me here, you can see, allow me to overwrite the initial or the Django default user table. So I'm going to be utilizing that. I need to also include in permission mix-ins, and that's going to just add all the mix-ins and permission settings for new users like it does in Django when we create new users. So that's going to be needed. So this is my new user table. This is what you're looking at right here. Excuse me. And you can see that I'm going to be utilizing email to authenticate, not the username like the default Django setting. Here we have the username, first name. Just to point out that I'm using underscores here. That's important when you're setting up the rest of the system. Start date. So the start date of when they signed up. A little bit about them. Obviously, you can expand these fields if you want to. And then is staff is going to be false. So these new users aren't going to be staff users. And also what's important is that when the user signs up, they will be set to inactive. So they won't be active, so they won't be able to log in. And the reason why this is because I like to bolt on an email service so that they have to go to their email, click on something to confirm that they are who they are, and then this will then become active. So I guess I can just add that to true now, so just for this system, but that's why it was false. And then we've created a custom account manager or a custom object manager for this to handle both normal users and super users. And then down here we've got the username field. So I've specified email. That's now the new username field. So previously in Django we used username as the main field. Now we're using email, and then required fields are just the required fields because both email and username has to be unique in the system, and it is a mandatory field for users to utilize. All right, so now that's in place, you can see that this is the custom manager here. So very briefly, I've got a different function here for managing super users when they log in. And you can see what I've done here is we've set the staff super user and is inactive to true. So that just gets activated to true when we create a super user. And you can see by utilizing required fields, that's just specifying that when we make a super user, that those fields must be completed. So a similar process here, we've got a raising errors. So there must be an email. So we're just checking for that. And that's pretty much about what's happened here. We save the user and carry on. So that's just a custom override of creating a new user. Okay, so that's the new user. That's the new model that we're using. So what we need to do now is just register that model. So we go into the core and settings, and we just need to register that. I'm not too sure why that's a problem still. Okay, so to register our new model, remember our model is in users and it's called new user. Now, that's a good point. So I've called my model new user. It's probably not the best name to call it, but let's just keep it for now. So let's just add that in. So now we're just defining to Django, that's our new user model. Users.new user. It's called new user. So at this point, we can go ahead and just migrate. So py. Let's make migrations. You could do a dry run if you wanted to. So you can see that there is a problem here. Auth user model refers to model. Users dot blah, 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 that has not been installed. So that seems to be a problem. So at this point, I haven't mentioned that we've just made a new user table. Now we did have a user table before. So the best course of practice here would probably be just to delete our existing database go into the blog here where we've got our migrations, just remove the initial migration. Let's do that first. So we're not creating any conflicts at all in our system. Let's go ahead now and just try and make migrations again. So you can see here that it still says improperly configured. Auth user model refers to model. So let's go back into, for example, our blog, because if you look inside the models here, we're trying to import the existing user model. That's what we're trying to use. So we need to overwrite this. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to need to go into the blog and then go into the models. And then what we're going to need at the top here is just we can do this many different ways, but I'm just going to make a link here to the settings. Inside of the settings was the configuration for our new model at the bottom here. So we can just reference that right there. And then inside of our author here, where we're referencing the user, now that's going to be changed. So that's going to be settings, and then the setting that we applied in the settings, which is auth user model. So let's just change that. Okay, so now that's been applied, so that ties that up. So let's just go ahead again and try and make migrations. So you can still see that we've got a problem here. So the problem looks to be in the forms now. So let's go over to the forms. So the forms are probably going to be somewhere in the admin here. So in the admin here, we reference, I believe, some items. And then, of course, it just hits me. It's not been installed. Okay, so let's go to settings. Let's actually define a new application. What's going on? So users, thank you very much. So obviously we need to apply it in our applications here, in our stored apps. So now let's go ahead and have a look. But it was something that we needed to do in the blog there, in actual fact. So let's go ahead and make migrations. Looks like it's working now. So we can do a migrate. There we go. So everything is migrated nicely. So now what we can do is go ahead and create a super user. So here is going to be different. If you're familiar with creating super user, notice that the email comes up straight away and not the username. And then we're asked for the username. And then we're asked for the first name. And then we're asked for a password. So username and first name was something that we specified, if you remember, in the model down here, wherever the model is, in the users, the model. Thank you. So we specified username and first name as required fields. So that's why we saw them just there. So let's just create a password. Okay, so there we have it. We've got a new user. So now that we've created a new user, we can now go ahead and just start the server and then test this out. So we can test this out. Remember, let's go back to Postman. Now, before we added the API token URL and we requested a post. So we're now set up the user. So we now have an email and password. So I've gone to the body, selected JSON. That's what we're going to send across. So this is how we're formulating our request. So we press send and then we have a look here. And you can see what we've done now is we've returned our refresh and access token. So let's have a look at our access token. So we're going to grab this token. Let's now go back to our web page, what we had open. Down here, we can now add it into here. And you can see on the right-hand side, all the different details that are being passed across. So within our token here, you can see that we're utilizing user ID number 1, which is interesting because if I now go back into my site and go to, let's just log in. The user that I've just logged in as should be user number 1. So just very quickly that we can't see that table because it's not been registered yet in the admin. So in the users, if you go to the admin, let's just quickly add a admin script for this. So this is just going to be nice and simple, nice and short and simple. So there we go. So the model that we're using is users model. So that's just another way of accessing our user model. You can see I've added some other things here and I've added some overrides, etc. This is all in the other tutorial I mentioned about. So the tutorial focused on creating custom users. So if you want to learn a little bit more about this, but that's just going to create our admin area. So let's just go back. We now registered the users, so it's here. So you see here it says new users. So it's not a very good name for the model. Of course, you could change that in the meta if you wanted to. So let's go in. We've got this new user here, and we can't see the ID. So let's just add the ID. So at the moment, what we can see here is the username, first name is active in staff. So if we just go ahead and just add the ID here, we can just get the ID for this particular user. There we go. So this is ID number 1. So you can see that matches the user. So the user that's logged in, they've just received a web token, our access token here, and our refresh token. And in the access token, embedded into that is the user ID. So like I said, that's really handy because if we're passing that data across, it means that we can pass it back to the Django, and it means then we can then perform additional actions related to that particular user. We could get the user details, for example, and collect that and bring it back across to the user and so on. So in addition to that, in actual fact, we don't cover it in this tutorial, but what we can also do is this payload data here can be expanded. We can add additional items to this if we wanted to. So this is an uncommon way of sending data back and forward. So if you could think about some of the different parameters that you might want to send across, you could put them in the payload and send them across as you send out the tokens. So now you can see that we've got the basics sorted here. We've got our refresh token, we've got our access token. We're able to access or give access and refresh tokens dependent upon who's logged in. That's all now completed. That's mainly because we've got this package that does it all for us almost. So let's now have a look at the settings and let's have a look at some of the configuration options available for this package that we're utilizing. So if we go back into the Simple JWT, if we look at the next page on, we can see that we've got some setting options here. So these options here we can utilize within our project. So we're going to define the refresh token and access token lifetime. So we can specify when they expire. So we're going to need to include time delta into our project. So we'll just include that in the top here. So that's just going to help us generate timestamps. And then let's go back into here and we're just going to copy this to begin with and we'll go through some of these different settings. Okay, so the top two here you can see access token lifetime and the refresh time. That's pretty simple, right? And then we've got the rotate refresh tokens. So this option here allows us that when someone requests a refresh token, a new access token and refresh token is generated. So for example, our refresh token is 1 day. Obviously this is 5 minutes. So every time someone utilizes the refresh token to get an access token, it also gives back a new refresh token. So it goes back to 1 day, a lifetime cycle, or it will expire in 1 day again. So that's something you can turn on and off if you want it. So we also have the blacklist after rotation. So that means we can blacklist the keys after the keys have been utilized. And that's just set to true to begin with. So we'll have a look at blacklists later on in the tutorial. So we've got our algorithm here, and if we have a look at the manual, you can see that there are many different algorithms that we can use here, more advanced, so RS256 up to RS512 and so on. So we won't drill down into this and RS private keys and so on, but this is a setting that if you're familiar with, you can get going and is something that we can look at a later date. So we've got this algorithm that's being utilized. We've got a secret key that we're using from the settings at the top of this file here. That's just going to add to the security and make our security unique for our particular project. And then we've got some other items here which you can read about. We're not going to touch them here, so they're not particularly too important for what we're doing right now. So the only other thing of noteworthy here, for at least this tutorial, is, for example, the auth header types. So there's multiple header types that you could utilize. So you can specify different header types if you want to, or lists of different header types, and that's important when you're sending data across. Essentially, you'll define the header type, and then you'll also provide the key in this type of format. We'll see this in the code once we get to the React front end, so that'll play out shortly. So the signing key here and the algorithm, that can also be changed and manipulated to make stronger algorithms, etc. If we have a look at the guidance here, you can see that this supports up to RS512. So that helps you kind of implement this into different systems. Maybe you've got RSA algorithms and so on, private keys and public keys and so on. So again, for this tutorial, this is an introduction to JWT, so we won't mention or go over any of those details there. What's important, I think, at this point, at least to begin with, is the fact that we can specify the token time, lifecycle time. We can specify whether they want to be rotated, whether we want to blacklist after they've been rotated, and in addition to that, the auth header types. Those are the key areas that we'll focus on or we'll utilize while we're developing in this tutorial. So the rest we can keep as they are. I say that, then I think, well, actually, this might be useful here. So the user ID field and the user ID claim. So we can specify some items here. And now remember what we returned back from the token that we returned back. If we go back into it, you can see it says ID, user ID, and then 1. So this is the prefix that we can utilize to then further use within the system to perform actions based upon the user that we are working with, for example. So again, we're not going to use that in this tutorial, but that's something that we can look at in a later tutorial. Okay, so that's some basic settings for JWT. So now we're going to focus on the actual login process. So we've created this custom user registration class here called custom user create. I suppose I could call that custom user registration. So I'll quickly breeze through this and connecting that all up. So you can see we've got some imports here. So status, response, API view. So we're just going to use the generic API view from the framework here, REST framework. And we're going to need some serializers. So we've connected that up. And we're also going to just use permission classes allow any. So obviously what we wouldn't want to do here, because we're going to post data, is to put, for example, admin only or authentication, because we're not going to be authenticated at this point when we're creating an account. A user is going to fill in the form, send their data across, and then we want this to be able to be processed. So we're going to capture the post that's sent. So we're going to override the post here. And you can see what, first of all, we're going to get the data. So reg serializer, we're going to get the data from the post, request.data, and then we're going to prepare it for serialization. And then we're going to create an if. So reg serializer is valid. So if the serialization data is valid, so if it matches what's expected to see, what the database is expected to see and save, then we can go ahead and actually then save the data. So let's go ahead and connect our serializers. So here we got from serializers, we're going to create a new serializer called register user serializer. So in the serializers, we created a new file here. You can see here what's going on. We've imported our model. We created a new class called register user serializer. And we've gone ahead and created some meta. So the model we're using is the new user. We want the fields, email, username, and password. So those are the mandatory fields in order to get someone registered. These fields need to be completed. And then we just define the extra arguments here that the password is write only. That's just for a little bit of security. So write only equals true. And then we go ahead and just do some more validation here. So on creation, we validate the password. And then if password is not set, if password is not none, then we're then going to continue and then go ahead and save the data. So that's pretty much all that does there. So we're just saving and validating the data that's being sent across. So this is just all standard kind of Django, and why I'm kind of breezing across it. It doesn't really relate too much to the Django Rest Framework. So like I said, just standard Django stuff going on here, validating the data that's being sent across. Okay, so that's my serializer. So remember, the serializer is just making the data palatable to be entered into the database, into a format that can then be utilized and saved into the database. Right, so that's our serializer done. So let's go to the URLs. So we want to be able to point to this. We need an endpoint for this, a registration endpoint. So I've created a new URL file here, and you can see that I've imported the views because we want the custom user create class we just created. So we bring that in, and then we've now got this registration point here, register. So let's just go into the URLs of the core. Now we want to point to that. So what we've done here is we've made a new entry here called API user. So the full URL path or the full endpoint for this is going to be API user / register. Okay, so that's going to be the endpoint for this registration where we're going to point our API or React in this case. So now we've got that in place, let's now take a look to see if it's working. So let's go back into our Postman right here, and we're going to go ahead and add a new entry here. So we've got post, and then we've pointed it to our API user register. We've got the 3 items. So in the body, we've selected raw and then JSON. So we're going to do this manually. We've got email, username, and password. So that's the data that we're going to send across to our API to register a new user. So I press send. Nothing's returned here. You can alternatively return something here. So now that's done, let's go back and refresh our administration, and we have a new user. So no doubt you want to maybe just pad this out, add some different clauses and responses and so on, just to capture any errors and so on. This is just a kind of a baseline, just to show proof of concept really. It is definitely functional, so you can definitely utilize it and build upon it. So you can see that's all the code that we're going to need to register the user. So when we go into the React application, because we've tested it on Postman here, we know that our endpoint is working okay and it's functioning okay. So we just need to now build up the React application so that we can register users. So we're just about done here in Django. We will revisit this when we start talking about blacklists. But if we go into the URLs here, you can see that these are all the endpoints that we're going to be utilizing. So API, that's the endpoint into the blog API, which is going to show all the data. We've got this user endpoint now, which is going to be utilized to register a user. And then we've got this here, the auth, API auth. That's just for the GUI front end for our REST framework. We can just remove that now if we want to. And then we've got our new token generation path here, API token, and our new refresh endpoint, API token refresh. So that's pretty much all the endpoints that we're going to need now. So we're now going to move over to React. So similar to Django here, we're going to build on top of what we started in tutorial 1. The repo is in the description, so if you want to download the code before we proceed to the next stage. This is where we finished the project in the first tutorial. We created a very simple framework here for a blog, and we were getting all the data from our Django DRF database and returning it here. Now you can see that it doesn't work now because obviously we've changed a few things around, so it's not going to work. So let's just have a look inside, see what it says. Oh, there's a few problems here. It doesn't really matter too much at this point because it shouldn't work anyway. So it's a bit bizarre. Okay, so it's working. That's the main thing. It starts, so we can definitely work from there. So once you download the package, you'll probably just need to run the npm to load in all the packages, the node modules here. Once you've got all that in place, you should just be able to run it, npm start, and then that's what you should be presented with. So let's just go into the project folder. So just to give you a recap of what's going on, we've got the entry point here, the index. What we've done here is we've made this structure so that we include a header and a footer and a middle component. So we've got 2 components here, the header and footer, and for some reason I've put them all in capitals. So let's just rename those. So we've got the header here at the top, and then we've got the footer. And then we've got the post loading page. So this is a wrapper around the post page. So what's happening here is we're going to load this post loading page. If there is data, then we'll load the post page. Otherwise, the post loading page will load. And that is what you saw just a second ago, the post loading data. So I'm just going to go ahead and lowercase all these. Yep. Okay, so now we just need to make sure that everything is as expected. So we just need to go into the index first. So here we're going to import header and footer. That looks okay. And then we've got the post loading. So if we go inside of the, apologies, I'm just talking. So what's going on? We've got the header and footer, sorry. Then we've got this middle component here, which is the app. So we're going to load up the app first. So that's the kind of central app going on here. So you can see we're loading in post and post loading. And what's happening here, we were trying to connect to our API in the previous tutorial. We're loading this all up. Then we were then loading the post loading component. And like I said, inside of that was wrapped around the post component. If there was data, then it would show the post component. So I'm just trying to work out why this isn't working. So bear with me. Okay, so the problem was there was no problem. I just reloaded the server. Okay, so now we've got this all in place. Now let's build this up. So let's remember what we're going to do. We're going to build a registration system. So let's remember, apologies, I keep saying the same things here, but let's remember this middle component. That's the component that we're going to change here. The head and footer is going to stay the same throughout the whole project. So we just want to loading different components into the center here. So we're going to need a registration, a register.js file. So we're going to register, and then obviously we're going to need to log in. So we're going to have a login file for that. And that's pretty much it. I think all we're going to need there. So those are the two templates. Log in and log out, of course. Let's do log out. There we go. So we got log in, log out, and register. So in this tutorial, we're going to be utilizing Axios. So we're going to move away from the built-in API calls that we can use. So let's go ahead and utilize that. So I'm going to try and leave a file here for you so that you can have a look at all the commands. All we're going to need to do here in this project is just install Axios. So let's just go ahead and npm install that. So this is another API package that we can utilize. It has a little bit more features than what we were previously using. There are obviously other packages available. So let's install Axios. And then what we're going to do then is create a baseline, which we're then going to import into other components. So trying to utilize good coding practice here of only using the same code once. So let's go into our main src. We're going to create a new file. I'm just going to call this axios.js. So that's going to be our main file, which we're going to call into every component where we need a connection to our API. So let's just first of all go ahead and build this up a little bit. So here we go. Right, so what we've got here, we import Axios from Axios, obviously, and then we've got our base URL. So this is our entry point into our API. So everything else that we do, we're going to import this in, and then we're just going to extend this. That's pretty much all that happens, because our API is always going to start from API. And then we build a connection. So here we've got Axios create. This is how we're going to build a connection. And then we've got the base URL. So we're going to bring in our base URL. We've got a timeout, just in case we can't connect. So we use a timeout, so it's not hanging forever. And then we've got some headers. Now, this is the important bit to remember here. So let's just go back into our settings in the Django application, if I can find that. And if you remember, I breezed over this auth header types. So this becomes important now, because remember what I said, that this is kind of a prefix before the token. So we need to code that in, and that's exactly what you're seeing here. So we're building authentication. Now remember, this is a key value we're building here. So if we go into the Postman, sorry to keep jumping around, but if we go into Postman here, remember what we did previously when we made a request, we needed to, if I can find it, I haven't shown you this actually. So when we make a request, we're sending two different things essentially here. The content type, so we're just defining we're sending JSON, and then we need to send another key called authorization, and then the actual value. Now the value we send across must start with JWT in our case, and then it has the key. So that's essentially what we're setting up here in our system. So authorization, and then we're getting the key. So we are using JWT. Remember, there's a space here. That's important. There has to be a space between the JWT item here and then the actual access token. And notice that we're going to store the access token in the local storage. So this is how to get the data out of the local storage. And here you can see the content type, application JSON, and that's about it there. Okay, so that's our basic connection we're going to use to connect to Axios. So now let's move over to the register. Let's do this first and actually build this up and get a user registered. Now I am using Material UI again, so I will give you a general overview of what's going on here, but it takes all day to kind of go through every single line here, what it's doing. It's just a little bit of styling. I am using the template from Material UI and just changing it around. I did give you some kind of an overview in the first tutorial as well, so I'll try not to repeat myself too much, but maybe just give you enough information in the important parts that are actually working to perform some sort of action that's important for this process. Okay, so I'm just going to dump this in. There we go, so it's fairly long. So here you can see at the top here, we're bringing in React and the use state from React. We're bringing in our Axios instance. So import Axios instance from Axios. So let's just go back to our Axios page. We have Axios here. We haven't exported it yet, actually, so there's going to be a problem in a second. So we're export that in a second. And next up, we're using history. So we're going to make a redirect. So from the React router DOM, we're going to use this tool, use history, to make a redirect. Because the idea here is that the user registers, and then they'll get taken to the home page, and then the data will be shown to them. So that's what's going to happen there. And then we got the Material UI stuff. These are all individual components for Material UI. So the idea or the concept here is that we're bringing in individual components, not the whole framework. And that just makes things nice and light and slimmed down. So we're bringing in all these individual components. If you're familiar with front ends, these make sense to you, potentially buttons, text fields, checkboxes, links, grids, topologies, typography. So there we go. So that's there. This is style overrides for the Material UI. So that's what you're looking at here. So it looks a little bit like CSS. So utilizing this different format here to formulate styling to overwrite Material UI's default settings. So we've got a bit of that going on there. And then we move on to the actual function here. So this is called sign up. So what we do first is we just bring in the history so that we can make a redirect. And then we're going to actually then create some data for our state. And you can see here what we're saving is email, username, and password. And what we've done here is we're using object freeze. If you hover over, it doesn't tell you. If you just type it into Google, it gives you an idea. The idea is that we get the user to type in their username and password and email. That's what they need to type in to actually register. And the idea is once we commit it, we're freezing that information so that it then cannot be changed in any particular way. So there's a little bit of security really, or that's the type of concept we're going for here, utilizing object freeze. So you can see that that's getting fed in here. This is being connected up here in our state here. And we're using form data and update form data to actually make the updates to our data. Right, so next up, we've got this item here. So I'll explain that in a second. But you can see down here, we've got the handle submit. So we're going to handle the submit, and then we've actually got the form in place here. So the container here just represents a registration form. Now, if you want to access this data or learn a little bit about it, if you go over to the Material UI site and then just go into the Get Started, templates, and there's a few templates here, and we're just using some of these templates here. So we're using this template here in actual fact. I've made a few modifications to it, but essentially that's what we're utilizing if you're interested in that. Right, so let's just go back now. So let's just think about the process here. We need a form. So if we go down here, we've got the button. That's the sign up button. So when we press the button to sign up, it takes us to on-click handle submit. The only thing else worthy in here is the fact that we're using on change. So that's just going to handle the change. So when we type something in to the form, it's going to change the state. That's essentially what's going on here. So we've got on handle submit and then handle change. Those are two components. You can see that there's a handle change in every single text field here that the user types in information. So that's what's going on here. The class form, so that's the custom classes that I mentioned up the top. So let's have a look at handle change. So you can see what's happening here in the handle change. We're taking in the data via E, and then we're getting the target and the name of it, and then we're getting the value, and then we're just trimming it because I think the data comes in with spaces. So we trim the data, and then what we do, we just then update. So here we're just referencing our data up here, and we're just then entering the data in. That's essentially what's happening there, utilizing update form data. Okay, so that's how the data is getting into our state here, so that when we send it, so handle submit, you can see that we've just got this console log here, just checking the data is what's expected. Obviously you can remove that. And now we have our axios instance, because now we have the data in place. When we press submit, we want to obviously send it across. So let's just make sure that we're sending it across in the right place. So we've got here, post it to user create. Remember that's API/user/create. So let's just double check that is the right place to send it. So if we go back into our URLs, we've got API user, and then in our URLs, we've got register. Okay, so we need to change that to register. So API user and then register. So that's where we want to send the data. And you can see what we're sending. We're getting the form data email, username and password. So we're creating a nice key value there to send across in a JSON type of format. And there we go. So that gets sent across. And then what happens? We then get nothing in return. In this case, remember, we didn't set up anything to be returned. So then we use the history function to then push the user to the login page. So the idea here is that the user will then go to the login page and log in. Now, obviously, I said before that I'd like to have some sort of email registration so that the user would receive an email that you need to click on that in order for then the user to be active. Obviously, we know that the users are active when they've signed up now, so we've just sent them off to the login page and then they can log in. So these console logs here are just for debugging when we're creating the script. Okay, so there we go. That's what's happening there. So just to confirm and just to quickly reiterate again, now that my code's messed up because I haven't turned off the beautify. So just to confirm, we've got this container. Inside of this container is a form. You can see it right here. So this form stretches the whole thing. And inside of this form, we've got a grid. This is material UI stuff. Inside of here, we've got text fields. So again, material UI, these are all just like parameters, classes, etc. And then we've got the on change, which handles changing the state as we type into the form. So down the bottom here, we've got the on click handle submit. That's going to fire off the function up here, which is then going to use the axios instance and then just extend the axios instance to the user register. So we're pointing in the right direction, utilizing the right endpoint, and then we're going to send this data off. If we get a good reply, then we're going to then push the user to the login page. Now, what I've just said there, if we get a good reply, we're not really doing any error checking here. I do apologize. You can extend this and just do some error checking there. Of course you can. That isn't a problem. So there we go. That's what's happening with register. So I guess we need to test it. Obviously, first thing we need to do is just make sure that the axios we export, because at the moment we're not exporting that or making it available. So we just finish off the axios there. We just export it so make it available in the other components. So we can close that now. So now we just need to configure the routes. So we've got the register page or the register component. Now we need to just add it all to the system so that we can actually get to it. So let's go into the index. So we need to add a new entry now, a new route for this. So let's go ahead and do that. So we've got one route at the moment. That's the home directory to the app. So let's add a new route for the register at /register. And then of course we need to actually bring it in. So this is register from the components and then register. Okay, so that's now imported in. So we've got that in place. And let's go into the header because we also need to make a new entry for it there. So I'm just going to overhaul quite a lot of this header. So you notice at the moment, all we have is a blog me up. So it's just a name of the blog. That's all we have in the actual navigation bar. So I want to add some links to it now and all the other kind of links that we're going to need. So you don't want to see me write out another 100 lines of code. So let's just expand on this now. And you can see what we've got now is just in our toolbar, we've got the blog link. So we're using a link here. And then what we're doing here is we're using the component equals navlink and then 2. So this is important. So we want to make a connection for this link here. So we're matching or utilizing material UI link. And then inside of here, we're setting out some parameters. So the component navlink and then 2/. So we're bringing in navlink. So we need to bring in navlink from the React Router DOM. This is all part of the router system. And you can see that we're using 2 to specify where we want to link to. So down here, we've got the component navlink and 2 register. And this is for the registration link. Okay, so that's really the only thing that I've changed apart from adding more links. And I've just added a little bit more style to move items to the right-hand side. So this is what you can see now. We've got a logout and a login, and we've got a registration form here. So if I click on register, that takes you to this page here. So now we've got 2 pages, or we've got the blog page, the home page, and we've got the register page here. So this is what you're now looking at, the registration page. So we've got this here. This is just for show. This link doesn't do anything, but you can obviously change that if you like. Right, so now we can go ahead and sign up. So let's do it. So we've got a new user. It has to be an email address. And then we've got a new username and a password. Right. So let's sign up. And nothing has happened. Right. So let's have a look to see what's going on. Okay, so we've got failed to load resource. The server responded with a status 400 bad request. So let's just check to make sure first of all we're sending it in the right place. That's always the first place to look. So what we can see here is that we are returning, because I've specified this, we're returning here the data that we're sending. So the data looks valid. Looks like a kind of a valid email and password. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. It looks like the actual data is okay. So failed to load resource. The server responded with a status of 400. So let's just double check, see if the actual server's on. So it looks like the server is on here. This is Django. No, this is React. Okay. Let's just open up our server. So many windows open. Okay, so you can see that we've received a bad request from React. Post API user register. Okay, so it looks like it's going in the right place. So let's just go ahead back into our Postman. And let's just double check again. API user register. So let's just register a new user. So you can see that in actual fact, a new user with this email already exists. So you can see one of the flaws of this code straight away, that we need to kind of send something back to the user if a problem occurs. And that's something that is missing from this code, most definitely, sending items back to response codes. So you can see that we're trying to make a a user, but the user already exists. So I think that is the problem here, because we're trying to make b@b.com. So I want to say I just wanted to point that out to you. So let's go ahead and now create a new user, and hopefully this time there we go. We're then forwarded to the home page. So we're not seeing any data yet because we haven't connected all that up yet. So don't worry about that. But it looks like we've registered. So let's go into the server and refresh. You can now see we've just created this new user, c@c.com ccc. So everything looks as though it's working. Great. Right, so next up then we go to the login, I guess. Let's do some logging in. Right, so it's the same type of process, to be honest with you. So we're going to have a form from Material UI, and it's the same type of process again. We're going to use the handle change, and we're going to have the handle submit. So everything's going to look pretty much exactly the same, except for we've got different text fields. So we've got a password text field and an email text field, because that's all we're going to need. We've got the button that is then submitting to the handle submit function. So you can see we've got the same type of setup here at the top, saving the data inside of our state here. And then we've got the handle submit. So same type of situation again. I do console log out the data just to make sure I'm sending the right data across. So I can check that if there is a problem. But this time I'm sending it to token. So remember, this is API token that I'm sending it to. I'm just extending the API in the axios file. And I'm just going to send across the email and password. And that's pretty much it. Except for this time, we're going to actually receive some data back from the server. So this time, we're going to actually receive the tokens. We've got two tokens, the access token, remember, and the refresh token. And you can see that we're going to put that, referencing the data as it's returned as res, and as for a result. And then what we're going to do is we're going to set an item in the local storage for the access token, and that's going to be the data that's returned. And then inside of that, we've got a data area, and inside of that, we've got the access, which refers to the access token. Similar thing there for the refresh token. And then what we do is we update the axios instance. So if we go back into the axios instance here, you can see that we've got this instance, this header instance here. So we want to update that with the new access token. So let's go back here. You can see that we've got the headers, and then we just update that with the authorization equals JWT, remember the space that was needed, plus the local storage get item access token. There we go. And then we got the history again, just to push people to the home page. Right. So in actual fact, it is all working. We did log in previously, and I think we logged in previously. It was all working. So I think this is just a case we haven't got any data. I think that's what the problem is at the moment. But let's just go into the login. Okay, so we need to connect it up. Let's connect this up. Right, let's go back into the index, and we just need a new entry here. So let me just grab that. So it's a similar process again. We've got the root. We're adding the logout while we're here. So we've got the login and logout. So we're going to also now need the login and logout. Let's import that in. So just connecting it to our components here. So we connect those up, and that's pretty much all that we're going to need to do in that file. So that just connects up the router, and that should be all that we need to do there. So let's go back into our view, and now we have login. So let's just try and log in. So we had our email address, sorry. And then we had the password. And then we press sign in. And there we go. So it's working. As you can see, we haven't got any posts. So let's just go into our admin area and add a post. So let's just call this new post. And we need a category. Apologies, we're going to need a category first, otherwise this won't work because of the foreign key we've got on our model. So let's just add a category first and then go into posts, add a new post. And then the author can be, we can apply C. to the author, and then published. So we press save, and then we go back, and then we can see a post. There we go. So everything seems to be working okay. So there we have our baseline for connections, both sending data and receiving data. So again, I just point out that if you were to expand on this code, you would probably look for kind of capturing some more errors. So this is where the code breaks down a little bit here if there are errors. So that is something that needs to be focused on, particularly in this code. But let's now move on to the next stage, because we've now got the next issue or the next problem that's going to occur. Our token is going to eventually, it's going to expire. So at the moment, we've got no way of then making a new token. So if you remember, now we need to deal with the refresh token. So we've already got the endpoint on Django, so that shouldn't be a problem. We should already have that. So if we go into the core URLs, we've got an endpoint for this, the refresh. So that's already in place. So now we need to actually do something to get that working. Right, so let's go into the Axios again. So we're going to work in here. So what Axios has for us, it has a tool called Axios Interceptors. So this is going to allow us to perform actions. It's going to intercept, and then it's going to perform an action for us. So what we want to do here is that when the server drops, when the connection ends, we want to then send off the refresh token and get a new token. So that's the process. We need to, Axios Interceptors is going to intercept the fact that we're logged out, or we don't have a token, or the token needs refreshing. And then it's going to run the code to send the refresh token to the server, and then the server is going to issue us some more tokens. That's going to update the local storage and also our header here. And that's going to happen seamlessly. So we're not going to know about it. The only way we're going to know about it is by going into the console, and it's going to indicate the fact that we've sent a request off to the refresh token URL, the endpoint. So I wanted to provide you a better example here to give you an idea of the type of errors that might occur and how to kind of protect yourself against those. Now, this will take a long time to do, so I've scoured the internet and found some different examples. So this is my own example. This is an example, and I'll have a link in the description for you to see where I got this from. So let's go ahead and just put in the new example here. Okay, so you can see that there's loads of different error responses here, and it captures to capture different things that might occur. So here you can see we're using Axios instance and then the interceptors. So we're going to respond by utilizing this code here. So there's a few different cravats here, isn't there? Because if you think about, we need to deal with different things. So if the server isn't connected, so we can't connect to the server, we need an error. So I've created this error. In actual fact, I've improved upon this code. So we've created this error here, which is if the server isn't working, so if there's a problem with cause on our server, this is the error that's going to be shown. Now, if this isn't here, in actual fact, we get this terrible error if we're using the development server. So here's just going to show a message saying that the fact that cause is broken or the server's not working. Okay, so then we move on. So here we have protecting ourselves from looping through trying to create more token refresh. So there's an instance where that might be the case. So that protects you from there. And then it just moves on. We've got these different unauthorized errors and so on. But eventually we get to the point where we actually then create or send off a request for a new token. So you can see here we're using the post token refresh, and then what we're sending is our refresh token in this name value pair here. So then we get a response, and you can see here what we're doing is we're updating the local storage with the new access token and refresh token, because we might get both. And then we're then updating the headers, and then we just return. And that's it. And you can see that these errors are being captured down here. And that's it. that's pretty much all that we need to do. So the main bulk of it is just right here, and you can see this is fairly simple. If you understood what was happening previously in the in the registration and login, you can see all we're doing is we're sending off a post to the token refresh. We're collecting the response, and then we're just putting it in our local storage and updating our headers. Easy, right? So that's pretty much all we need to do there. So it's hard to simulate this. So let's just go into our settings, and let's just make the refresh token, say just 1 minute, for example. The last step in this process is to deal with the logout. So what we're going to do here is when the user logs out, we're going to put their refresh token in a blacklist. So they can no longer get any more access tokens from that refresh token. So then therefore they need to log back in again. So let's simulate that now. So we've got the blacklist after rotation to true. And we now need to just add a new item into our framework. So let's go ahead and do that. So inside of our installed apps, at the top here, we just need to add in the token blacklist. So we'll do that first. Now you've probably already seen in the admin, if I can get back to the admin, we've got the blacklisted tokens and outstanding tokens in our database already. So this isn't working at the moment because we've not hooked this all up. So now we're just going to go in and do exactly that. So let's go into our users, and we're going to our views, and let's just create a new view now for this. So the process here is that what's going to happen, the user's going to press the logout button. That's going to fire off an API to this view, and that's going to then process their refresh token and then put it into the blacklist database table. So let's go ahead and bring in from the REST framework the refresh tokens. Okay, so let's bring that in, and we've created a new class here called blacklist token view. We're just using the API view, generic API view again, and we've got permission classes allow any again because we want people to be able to change this. So then what we have is a new function here. So this is a post request that we're sending across. So we're then going to capture that, and then we're going to then get the refresh token from the data, put it into this new variable called refresh token, and then we're going to go ahead and update or actually then apply that into the table. So we're going to put it into a table, and then if there's a problem, we've got this exception here. We're going to just respond to 400. Finally, we're just going to need to hook this up to a URL. So let's go ahead into the URLs of users, add a logout blacklist, and we'll just hook up the view as per normal. So this is going to be a bit of a long one here because we've got API/users/logout/blacklist. So that's the full URL for this. So now we can go ahead and go back into our React application and then just finish off the logout. So this is a fairly simple process here now. If you're familiar and you're getting used to utilizing Axios, so we're going to bring in we don't need the state. So we're going to be utilizing useEffect here from React, and we're going to use the Axios instance again. And then we've got the history because we're going to perform a redirect. So here we set up the redirect in preparation to actually redirect the user. And then we use useEffect here to then create an Axios instance. So here we've got user logout blacklist, and then we're going to send across our refresh token. And then we just go ahead and remove item this time, the access token from the local storage, and then we just remove the headers. And there we go. And then we just redirect the user. It's as simple as that. So we've already hooked up our URL or the router, so that shouldn't be a problem. So let's test this out. So we are currently logged in as a user. You can see all the data here in the local storage. So if I click on log out, you can see that that gets now removed. We get forwarded to the sign in page, and that's just about it. So we now have all the tools in place. You can go ahead now and just test that out. So if you were to now test the refresh token, that shouldn't now be providing you any more access tokens. So if we go ahead and have a look inside of the, blacklisted tokens, we've still got an error here. Token blacklist, blacklisted token is an error. So let's just fix that. So this probably just needs an update. I'm in the wrong system here. Okay, so I'm in the right place. Okay, so let's just migrate. There we go. So that was the problem there. So if I refresh, after I've obviously turned on the server, it's getting late. Okay, so now when I refresh, it should work. Okay, so let's go ahead and try that one more time. So let's just log in. We'll use the user we used before. Okay, so you've done that, and then press log out, and then go back to our table, and there we go. So we now have blacklisted that refresh key. There we go. So we have now all the components in place. This is a good base now for you to work on and maybe apply into one of your projects. Okay, so we kind of crawled across the line there, but everything is now set. We have a baseline for this. So we now have our Django DRF server with JWT tokens being delivered to a React front end. From here, it's about shoring things up, making sure we've got everything in place to capture any errors. So like I said before, that's something that we can improve. And then it's just drilling down on some of the different aspects to make things a little bit more secure and a little bit more robust. Apologies, there's no testing here. That would take probably another hour for us to go through at this point. So maybe we can deliver some of that in later tutorials. So I do apologize about that. And hopefully I'll see you in the next tutorial.